North Korea's latest displays of defiance include 3 days of live fire drills over the weekend off its west coast into a maritime buffer zone near South Korea's Pyongyang and Yeonpyeong-do islands. So what has been the response to North Korea's most recent saber rattling? And are we looking at heightened prospects of a hostile confrontation on the Korean peninsula? Also, how do we better navigate this latest storm of tensions? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. It's Wednesday, January 10th here in South Korea. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we have our panel of foreign journalists in the studio to touch upon the latest stories here on the peninsula that made global headlines as well. For this, I have Nicolas Rocca here in the studio with me. Nicolas, welcome back.
Good to be here.
I also have Anthony Kuhn with us. Anthony, it's been a while. Welcome back to the studio.
Nice to join you.
Right. Nicolas, pundits here in South Korea believe that Pyongyang's live fire drills that occurred this past weekend seek to rattle public sentiment ahead of our parliamentary election scheduled in April. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's been a history of North Korea, taking military action close to elections, either in the United States or in South Korea. Prior to the presidential election of 2020, there's been, I think, 4 short-range ballistic missile launch in less than a month. There was a nuclear test in 2016. So I think it's something we've already seen. What we observed last weekend was not the peak of North Korea military actions. They could have taken more serious action. They've got a lot of variety of range in terms of provocation. It could have been a new ICBM test over Japan, for instance, or a nuclear test. So I think for now the impact is limited. But given the tone of the DPRK's official speech those recent weeks, the current geopolitical evolution, it is going to be part of the debates, I guess, here in South Korea. How it will really affect the general election of April, it's hard to tell, because the two main parties have their own narrative on the North Korean issue. Min Jung is more willing to discuss. Current President Yoon Suk-yeol is a partisan of more hawkish position of deterrence by force. So I think probably it will have a limited impact, and maybe it will be more internal affairs that are going to be debated. But we need to see what North Korea is going to do in the next few weeks to really know if it is going to be a main issue or not.
Right. And aside from rattling public sentiment here, Nicolas, there is also concern that North Korea is seeking to perhaps fuel public distrust in the military here. We had Kim Yo Jung talking about mocking, that is, South Korea's weapons detection capabilities. What are your thoughts on this?
So what happened is, there were 3 consecutive days of artillery firing by North Korea. And what Kim Yo Jung said, that on Saturday they did not fire artillery shells, but they just made explosions, pretending that it was actually artillery shells, in order to show that the ROK army couldn't detect, and that the lack of detection of could create accidents in the near future. South Korean army says it had detected both the explosion on the North Korean coast and the shells. It's hard to know what actually happened. Some experts tend to point out that probably it's hard to imagine that South Korea didn't detect them, because shells leave a splash of waters in the sea, and that radar could detect it. Well, what happened, it seems to me that it's a form of psychological warfare, testing each other's position, trying to see how Seoul is reacting to different kind of actions that they're taking. I think what we need to bear in mind from what happened last weekend is that North Korea is definitely saying the 2018 agreement is definitely over, and we're taking actions on some of the buffer zones that we previously established at places where we wouldn't take action. Even though they did it in the past, it's not the first time that North Korea is firing artillery shells near the northern limit line. But it's just pointing out that things have changed now, and the speech and the tone of the speech from North Korea has definitely changed.
Right. And Anthony, what's your take with regard to North Korea's latest saber rattling, which included fresh words of hostility by its leader Kim Jong-un as well? He claimed claimed he would not start a war, but neither would he avoid one.
Right. Well, as Nicolas said, military provocations have long been a part of North Korea's toolkit. I think the question is whether their underlying strategy has shifted. And we certainly see signs of that happening in the international realm, of them saying they're giving up on seeking a grand bargain with the U.S. in which they partially denuclearize in exchange for example, sanctions relief or improved relations with the U.S. Instead, they seem to be drawing closer to Russia and China. And we get the sense from Kim's letters to Donald Trump that he was heavily invested in the summitry that went on in 2018 and 2019 and felt personally betrayed, burned by, the collapse of diplomacy in 2019. So I think even if Donald Trump is reelected next year, it remains to be seen whether, Kim would go back to some form of diplomacy. So instead, Kim seems to be intending to get what he needs diplomatically and economically from Russia and China, despite possible limitations about how Russia and China might go about this. And then the inter-Korean implication is now that he's talking about suppressing South Korea militarily, and dealing with South Korea not as brethren to be united with someday, but as a hostile force to be dealt with. So that's quite concerning.
And keeping that in mind, Anthony, what do you suppose are the risks of an actual hostile confrontation on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it was reported in state media today that Kim Jong-un visited munitions factories. And Kim said that this year will mark a, quote, radical turn in boosting the country's preparations for war. Again, the question is, what is the strategic calculation? Does he really believe, as his grandfather did, that there is no other solution to the Korean issue than a military one? And if he intends to, if he's preparing for war, how does he see it start? Well, this weekend's artillery fire incident suggested one way in which it could happen. There's a provocation, and either or both sides, the North or the South, miscalculate. They take it, they believe they are being threatened, and they strike out militarily. And certainly the focus in recent days have been over the islands off the west coast, Pyongyang and Yongpyong, but I think if we're talking about real preparations for war, if this is Kim's strategic calculation, then it's not going to be just those islands, but the whole country that's going to have to really start taking notice.
Hopefully we'll not go that far, though, right?
Right.
Nicolas, the universal understanding is that a common enemy will spur some form of unity. Now, speaking about South Korea's political arena, this threat posed by North Korea does not appear to bring lawmakers from across the aisle together. Do you suppose we've become, here in South Korea, inured to threats posed by North Korea? And if that is the case, what is the danger of this particular reality, do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't think that, in the case of South Korea, North Korea is a factor of unity, if it stays this way. In a way, it's one of the main division between the two political parties of South Korea. Two different approaches, so it's hard to imagine that if there's no major accidents, that it will spur unity. But as Anthony said, as the risk of escalation is getting stronger, as the risk of miscalculation and error from one or both sides is making it more and more likely that accident could happen, and maybe loss and civil loss could occur, like it happened in 2010 in Yongpyong, for instance. In that case, it would probably spur unity. It could be, more a factor of making, both sides of the parliament work together, because, the nation itself would be more in danger. I think, to answer your question, that yes, it seems that most of the population of South Korea is used to, the threats of Pyongyang, and it seems quite natural if you're born in a country where, every now and then there's reports about ballistic missiles firing, reports about threats. different cycle of negotiation and then provocation. It seems logical that in a way you're used to it because your life has to go on, and most of my friends here in South Korea are used to those tensions, and it's part of their everyday life. The danger of that is that in case something serious actually happens, it might not be taken immediately seriously by part of the population. We've seen, for instance, during the evacuation exercise that occurred in this summer, the preparation, that it was not taken seriously by a large part of the population. When there was this alert also to evacuate Seoul after or to more go to shelters after a satellite launch from North Korea, even if it was a false alert, it was not taken that seriously. So yeah, the question is when it will occur, and if it occurs, which we don't hope for, will the population take it seriously? It seems that there could be some times where people might think it's again a false alert, or it's we're used to it and it's not serious. So yeah, that is part of the danger of being so used to those threats, and yeah.
Right, indeed. And talking about our politicians, Anthony, there's been quite a bit of foreign media coverage about the political polarization here in South Korea. Do you share this view?
Well, this, of course, came up because of the attack against opposition leader Lee Jae-myung in Busan recently. I certainly feel the political polarization. I see it on the street in protests. I happen to live not far from the presidential compound. And it's always been apparent. And also, as an American, I feel a lot in common. One is I hear that at holiday dinners, there are uncomfortable moments when conversation turns to politics and difference among relatives comes to the fore. And also incidents in the news in which alienated lone wolf type figures, loners with extreme political views, strike out violently. The difference, of course, being that in this country they are not often armed with assault weapons, luckily. Yes, I see it in the news all the time. Polarization among, different regions of South Korea, among different age groups. The differences that are highlighted by the sort of compressed period of industrialization, the different phases of democratization and development that different generations have gone through. And so, yes, I think it is apparent, and the feeling of toxicity sometimes strikes one. At the same time, I'm also aware that this is often amplified by media and social media, and that there are a lot of people who are not speaking up, who are maybe not quite as polarized.
Right. Despite their political differences, though, Nicolas, our lawmakers, they do see eye to eye on Korea's dismal birth rate. And that being said, there have been growing calls here in the country to take lessons from your country, France itself, with regard to birth rates. What can you share with us?
Well, I think it's a major issue that South Korea has to deal with in one way and another, because the fertility rate is dramatically low, around 0.7. It is true that in France it's higher, 1.8. It's hard to explain, such an issue with only one factor, and the story of every country is very different. But what we can point out, and some of the differences, is that France dedicates 4% of its GDP to policies towards family, parental leave, family support, etc., whereas it's around 1% in South Korea. And most studies shows that countries that tend to dedicate more of their budget towards the family, family support policies have higher fertility rates. Then there's gender inequality, that is, of course, a major factor. Korea ranks really, really high, unfortunately, in that sector. Women earning around 30% less than men at the same position. Also, there's a lot of studies showing that, it hurts your career as a Korean woman to have a pregnancy. So I think this is something the government has to focus on and has to tackle quickly, even though there's been talks about very long parental leave, for instance, but it has to be a more global policies. Then I think that's more of a social issue. There's a high expectancy on the role of a mother in Korea. What moms in Korea have to do for their children, it's really a lot, and probably you know, we say it takes a country to raise the children, and probably if children could go to daycare earlier, you know, and maybe the task be divided and not rest mostly on the shoulders of women, it could help things. Then the education system is quite costly in Korea with the overwhelming you know, private education, the cost of hagwons. But there's also other factors that are you know, just the cost of an apartment, etc. So in the end, I mean, considering that the rate is so low, it's hard to imagine that even all those policies and trying to copy other country might work. But there's also the possibility, for instance, of opening maybe the door to more migration, to input from outside in order for them to enter the workforce. So it could, you know, at least for a short moment, resolve some of the issues. For instance, the tension on the pension system. So yeah, I think to try to tackle this issue, Korea has to look in different directions, take inspiration from various countries, and, you know, try to applicate it to its kind of unique situation.
Right. And Anthony, what would you suggest to better address Korea's low birth rate?
Well, I think really it's a matter of prioritizing the matter. Although this country has the lowest fertility rate, I believe, of any, the lowest birth rate, Japan has the more aged society, and they've been battling this problem for 2 decades and still have not been able to turn it around. I report on that country as well. I have been to places where they have experienced local successes by following the example of Western and Northern European countries and drastically increasing the amount of childcare support and educational support. On the national level, they have not been able to do it, and the government of Fumio Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida, has not shown that, you know, how they're going to pay for it, and the public remains rather skeptical that they will prioritize it as highly as, for example, national defense, where they're greatly increasing spending. In Japan, you know, you can't really escape this subject. The labor crunch just comes up in every field you deal with, whether it's taxi drivers or construction workers. And although they're not saying they're going to become an immigrant society, they are gradually opening some of these fields to make it easier for foreign workers to come in. I think South Korea is similar in some respects. I've been to the south of the country where I saw fields being cultivated mostly by Southeast Asian workers, particularly from Cambodia, for example. But I found there that the farmers, the average age of them is sort of in their mid-70s. So, and their offspring, we should say, do not want to follow in their parents' footsteps and till the land. And so that means they have about maybe 5 years or so until their parents have to retire. So at some point, this issue is going to become inescapable, so I'm hoping that this is the time when the government will prioritize it.
Right. Well, the Yoon administration has spoken about thinking outside the box to tackle the issue, so hopefully we'll see some tangible steps this year. Anthony, another concern here in the country on the social front, of course, is the prevalence of suicides, with the most recent high-profile tragedy involving Parasite actor Lee Sung-kyun. Generally speaking, Anthony, do you suppose that we here in Korea hold our celebrities to a relatively higher standard?
It certainly seems that way. You know, we see in the media stories about suggesting the expectations for celebrities in this country, whether it's military service for musicians such as BTS, or the management agencies of young stars and how they sort of have a say over their employees' private lives and things like that. Certainly, from a Western perspective, we are quite used to seeing a fair amount of hedonism, as we say in the West, sex and drugs and rock and roll among celebrities. And although they get in trouble with the law, it's not seen as that exceptional. Also, this, you know, the psychological toll upon the actors that we see. of this sort of thing that drives them to suicide. It seems that they put, you know, choose death before dishonor is quite shocking, I think, to a lot of people. Of course, it's not just celebrities. The other thing it brings to mind is former Seoul Mayor Park Won-soon, who committed suicide after allegations of sexual harassment. So I think there's a psychological aspect to it, which outsiders see as quite inconceivable and shocking.
Right, it really is tragic, of course. And Nicolas, Jongun was facing drug allegations at the time of his suicide. And amid Korea's fight against drugs, there is a bit of debate about whether focus should be spent on simply punishing the abuse or treating the addiction. What are your thoughts?
I would have to agree that treating the addiction has to be part of the solution. I mean, no country has solved any drug war with only, you know, a very authoritarian approach on, you know, just you know, fighting against the abuse. It has to be seen also as a social mental health issues, and maybe the perception has to change from, you know, drug users being only people that are, you know, abusers or criminal, and to accept that, at least for part of them, it's a mental health issue. And, you know, probably, I think Korea started to go into that direction because now I believe that most of the new drug users in Korea are amongst the younger generation, and there's been sensibilization classes that started in classes for, you know, in Korean schools around 10 hours. So I think that's a step in the right direction. But there's very few rehabilitation centers in Korea. I think when I last checked in spring, it was around 6, whereas in Japan it's around 100. So the figures are quite different. And I think, yeah, that Korea used to be a country where the drug level were really low. It still isn't high compared to most of the countries, but as drug consumption gets a bit more common, I think it has to be also tackled as a you know, a social issue, and mental health has to be considered in that case.
Right, indeed, and of course the administration is working to raise more awareness about the danger of drugs as well. All right, Nicolas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts, and Anthony, thank you very much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Thursday.